This is Contact, AMI Audio's weekly look beyond the headlines, talking to the people behind the story. Informative, thought-provoking, and accessible. Join us now as AMI makes Contact.
I'm Catherine McDonald. In this International Women's Day edition of Contact, we speak to two women on how people with disabilities are perceived by individuals and portrayed in the media. We pose the question of whether there is a difference in attitudes towards women with disabilities and men with disabilities. In the first half, we speak to Philippa Willitts, UK-based freelance writer and blogger. In the second half, we speak to Liz Malone, who writes, edits, and produces the weekly podcast Access Point in New York City on living with a disability, as well as the ongoing challenge of disabled representation in media. In January, Philippa Willitts wrote an article for her blog titled, "I am disabled and people tell me on a regular basis that they would rather die than be like me." The story outlined conversations she had with people who believed that having a disability was a fate worse than death. Ms. Willitts has been published in numerous publications, such as The Guardian, The Independent, and The Feminist Times. She spoke to AMI's Anastasia McLean on the phone from Sheffield, England, regarding the article and the public perception of the value of a disabled life. At the end of the interview, Ms. Willitts also makes an interesting observation on how language is used to refer to disabled people in the UK and North America.
Your recent article on people telling you they would rather die than be disabled was interesting and disheartening at the same time. Could you give us an example of someone telling you this?
The main one that sticks in my mind is the very first time it happened. I'd had some surgery that was supposed to be quite small but ended up causing damage that left me with a lot of pain. And so where I was supposed to be on crutches for a couple of days, I'm still on them several years later. And early on, I found it very difficult to adapt to using crutches. The practicalities of life were suddenly really complicated. And I got on my local bus, and I hadn't ventured out much because everything was very painful. And I got on the bus, and the driver, who I'm kind of familiar with, looked at my crutches and said, I'd kill myself if I became disabled. And it took me so much by surprise that somebody would think that was an acceptable thing to say, really.
And have you heard this kind of comment more than once?
Yes, I have. Strangers in the street say weird things to disabled people. This has become clear, not just with my life, but I know from friends. Strangers say weird things. Strangers ask me what's wrong with me when it's, just because we're next to each other in a queue in a shop or something, which is intrusive and inappropriate. And so similarly, I've had that said to me there was a woman in a cafe. She was just sitting on the next table and just thought she'd mention that if she became disabled, she'd kill herself. It's happened on several occasions, and every time it strikes me as really rude and very much a kind of judgment about what non-disabled people think disability is like, really.
And what has been your response?
To be honest, I think of smart, clever responses much later. At the time, I don't think I've ever really challenged it. I think what I have said is, well, if when it happens, you just deal with it, and it's not a judgment you can make at this stage.
Do you think that people make these kinds of comments for the same reasons that they might ask someone, why aren't you married, or when are you and your spouse having kids? So they're really expressing their own fear and ignorance about the very notion of being different because maybe they've learned it's more comfortable for everyone if everyone's the same.
I think that's a very good observation, actually, and I think there is probably some truth in that. I remember at my sister's wedding and everybody saying, "Oh, you'll be next," and me thinking, "No, I won't." But people expect certain things, and people are comfortable if things happen in a certain order or in a certain way, and don't quite know how to cope if it doesn't.
Apart from that being a very insulting thing for someone to say to someone with a disability, is there another route to this attitude? Does it come from somewhere else other than the fear and ignorance?
I think it's based on massive assumptions about what disability is like. I think people imagine this story of tragedy that certainly things like charities historically haven't helped with. A lot of charity campaigns are based on sharing how terrible and tragic it is. And then some media reporting takes the same route and does the same thing. Stories of, isn't this awful, poor girl, what on earth shall she do? I think people who aren't disabled or who don't really have much experience of other disabled people probably absorb this and make assumptions from that about what life must be like.
So getting that kind of media message about what it's like to be disabled, do you think some of the people who express the sentiment that they've expressed to you are really saying they don't think that they personally have the fortitude to deal with certain challenges?
I think everybody faces challenges in their lives of one kind or another, whether it's somebody dying or the end of a relationship or becoming ill or somebody else becoming ill. And we all deal with all sorts of challenges that had we thought about them beforehand, we might have thought, I'd never be able to cope with that. But then awful things happen and we do cope generally. So I guess these people are looking at somebody else, whether it's me on crutches or friends in wheelchairs or whatever it is. And yeah, they put themselves in that position in a very shallow way and just think that must be terrible and don't really get beyond that.
Do you think a segment of society considers a disabled person's life less valuable than that of an able-bodied person?
I think the depressing answer to that is that yes, often that is the case. I can only really talk the UK, but here the last few years have been really, really punitive and horrible for a lot of disabled people. We've lost a lot of provision in terms of healthcare, in terms of benefits, in terms of social care, independent living. We've lost a lot of that, and things have got a lot harder for a lot of people. And combined with that has been a growing media narrative that runs strangely alongside the pity narrative, but completely almost contradicts it, which is that disabled people are basically using up public money. We're costing a lot in healthcare, we're costing a lot in benefits, and that we're essentially all lazy, work-shy people who just exist to take taxpayers' money. And it's a horrible environment to be living in. I had a stranger just a few weeks ago come up to me and tell me to get a job. And I said, I've got a job. And he said, no, you haven't. You've got a stick. And I thought, is that really the message now? That because I'm disabled, I couldn't possibly have a job. And when I said I did, he thought that was impossible because I was disabled, and yet he was telling me to get a job. It's a very mixed message. And so a lot of the tabloid, especially media, is giving out a message that disabled people are wasting everybody's money. At the same time, we're objects to be pitied. At the same time, we are losing a lot of support that's been in place. And so I think the mixed media messages are probably confusing to people, but there is, I think there is a sense in a lot of people that our lives are worth less.
So how do we overcome these kinds of negative perceptions about people with disabilities?
I think the media, and that's a very big term, I know, but I think a lot could be done about better representation. Things are improving in terms of, say, the popular soap operas on TV. Quite a lot of those now have a disabled character in it, and most of those, in fact, all I think currently are played by genuinely disabled actors rather than non-disabled actors pretending to be disabled. But I think that kind of increased visibility of just kind of disabled people doing normal stuff as well as facing the issues we face. And I think things like having more voices in the media, more disabled people reporting on disability issues, I think visibility can only help if it's on our terms, really, and if it shows that disabled people are as wide-ranging and as different from one another as anybody else. Then that, I think, could start to counter some of the myths and some of the prominent kind of tropes that we see in the media currently.
If we break it down even further, do you think society in general makes a distinction between a woman with a disability and a man having a disability?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are differences. It's difficult to compare, first of all, because there will always be exceptions, and you risk kind of getting onto territory, a phrase I like, oppression Olympics. Who is more oppressed? Is the gay disabled man more oppressed than the straight disabled woman? And is the black disabled woman? It's very difficult to start. But I think one thing that does happen with disabled men is that some of what they experience mirrors what most women experience in terms of being perceived as public property. Women often are grabbed, groped, spoken to, told to smile, all of that stuff. And a lot of men, when they find out just how prevalent that is, are really, really surprised. Whereas disabled people, men and women, get grabbed in a different way, not necessarily a sexual way, but I know a blind woman who is periodically, someone crosses her over the road, even if she wasn't trying to cross the road. They just see a blind person and assume they need help crossing the road. I have a friend who's a wheelchair user who had to get a specific wheelchair just to stop people grabbing the handles and pushing her.
Are you proud to be a person with a disability?
Absolutely. It's a strange thing because I kind of feel that you should be proud of things you've done rather than things that just happen to you. But at the same time, things can be hard, and I'm doing all right, and that makes me proud. I also just wanted to say, just because it occurred to me, there's a across the Atlantic language difference where here we tend to say disabled people, and on your side of the pond tend to say people with disabilities. But so just so you're aware, it's just one of those things here in the social model of disability. It's very much preferred to be called disabled rather than with a disability. And I understand that in the States and in Canada, the people first thing is felt, is very important. So I was aware as we were talking that we were doing that differently, but I think that's okay. We just both went with what we use, really. And
is there a negative connotation associated with saying person with a disability over on your side of the pond?
There is, to a degree. There is, especially for people who believe strongly in the social model of disability. In that sense, disability is what is kind of put on us by society rather than something that we have. So I have impairments, but what disables me is steps and places with inaccessible toilets. That's what disables me rather than my body. Whereas person with a disability implies that the disability is to do with you as an individual rather than society that is disabling us.
That was freelance writer Philippa Willitts in conversation with AMI's Anastasia McLean on the phone from Sheffield, England. To find more information on Ms. Willitts, you can follow her on Twitter with her handle Philippa Writes. That's spelt PhilippaWrites, and online at philippawrites.co.uk.
This is Contact on AMI Audio.